Most Americans think they understand the world map. They've seen it in classrooms, on weather channels and documentaries. They've pointed to the bottom right corner of the globe and said, "Oh yeah, Australia, that small country with kangaroos." Small. That word falls apart the moment you look closer. Because what if everything you thought about Australia's size was completely wrong? What if the land you imagined as just another country is actually an entire continent hiding in plain sight? Welcome back to my channel. If you're new here, please subscribe, like my video, and turn on notifications so you don't miss our next update. It usually starts the same way. Someone pulls up a map, someone zooms out, someone squints, and then comes the pause. Wait, why does it look that big? That's when the perception cracks. Because Australia isn't just a country, it's the only nation on Earth that occupies a whole continent. The Australia continent. Not a region, not a cluster of states, a continent. The shock hits harder when the comparison begins. Type in Australia versus USA size comparison and watch the disbelief unfold. On the standard classroom map, the United States stretches wide and dominant across the page, while Australia looks modest, almost compact. But here's the twist most Americans never see coming. Australia is about 7.7 million square kilometers. The contiguous United States? Roughly 8 million. That's not a tiny island. That's nearly the same size. And yet, one is perceived as massive, and the other as that place with beaches and accents. How big is Australia really? Big enough that flying from Sydney to Perth takes about 5 hours. Think about that. 5 hours inside one country. That's like flying from New York to Los Angeles. Americans are used to long domestic flights, sure, but mentally, they don't associate that scale with Australia, because maps lie. The Mercator projection, the most common world map design, distorts size dramatically. Countries closer to the poles appear larger. Greenland looks enormous, Europe looks dominant. Australia, sitting lower on the map, doesn't get the visual exaggeration treatment. So subconsciously, it feels smaller, less significant. But shrink the distortion and suddenly the Australia geography explained in true scale looks staggering. And here's where it gets even more fascinating. Australia isn't just big. It's diverse in ways that feel almost unreal. Americans often imagine it as one giant desert with a few coastal cities clinging to the edges. But that's only part of the story. Yes, the outback is vast and dry, but Australia also has tropical rainforests in Queensland, snow-covered mountains in the Australian Alps, world-famous coral reefs, and more than 25,000 kilometers of coastline. That's longer than the entire coastline of the contiguous United States. Let that sink in. One country, one continent, thousands upon thousands of miles of coastline. And yet the stereotype persists. Hot, flat, full of spiders. The American reaction to Australia often shifts from amusement to genuine disbelief the deeper they dig. Because once you start comparing state to state, the numbers stop being abstract. Texas is about 695,000 square kilometers. Western Australia alone, over 2.5 million. One Australian state is more than 3 times the size of Texas. Suddenly the phrase small country sounds ridiculous. But size isn't the only shock. Isolation plays a massive role in how Australia is perceived. Americans can drive across borders into Canada or Mexico. Europe is a web of neighboring nations packed tightly together. Australia, it sits alone, surrounded by ocean. The nearest major landmass is thousands of miles away. That isolation shaped its wildlife, its culture, even its national identity. Which brings us to another moment Americans don't expect. Wildlife? Yes, there are kangaroos. Yes, there are dangerous snakes and spiders. But the idea that every corner of Australia is crawling with lethal creatures is exaggerated. It's dramatic, it's clickable, it's viral. The reality? Most Australians live in modern urban environments that feel just as developed as cities in America. Walk through Melbourne's downtown and you'll see trams, skyscrapers, coffee culture, art, sports stadiums, not crocodiles roaming the streets. And yet the stereotype continues because distance breeds myth. Here's a question that changes everything. If Australia is nearly as large as the United States, why does it feel so much smaller in global conversations? Population. The United States has over 330 million people. Australia has around 26 million. That's fewer people than the state of Texas. Imagine spreading 26 million people across nearly the same landmass as the entire US. The result? Massive open spaces, vast highways with nothing but horizon. Towns separated by hours of driving. A sense of scale that feels cinematic. This is where many Americans experience their second wave of shock, because when you realize Australia is both a country and a continent, you start to understand why travel there feels different. Flying into Sydney doesn't mean you've seen Australia. That's like landing in New York and claiming you've explored all of America. Perth alone is closer to Southeast Asia than it is to Sydney. Think about that geographic reality. Western Australia leans toward Indonesia. Eastern Australia faces the Pacific. The distances stretch imagination. Australia geography explained properly reveals something else. It contains multiple climate zones. Tropical in the north, temperate in the south, arid in the center, alpine in the southeast. It's not one environment, it's many stitched together on a single landmass. Midway through this realization, there's usually silence, a recalibration, a mental zoom out. Because suddenly, Australia versus USA size comparison isn't just trivia, it's perspective shifting. And then someone overlays the maps. When you drag Australia over the United States on a true size comparison tool, it stretches from the east coast to the west coast. It covers nearly the same width. That visual hits harder than any statistic. It's undeniable, it forces a rewrite of everything you casually assumed. But here's where it gets even more interesting. Australia is technically part of the continent, sometimes referred to as Australia or Oceania, depending on geographic classification. In many models, Australia itself is considered the continent because it sits on its own continental plate. That geological independence makes it unique. There's no other country that can say, "We are the continent." Not Europe, not Africa, not Asia. Australia stands alone in that category. And yet the narrative outside of it often reduces it to beaches and barbecues. Culturally, Americans expect similarities because both countries share English as a primary language. But the differences run deep. Driving on the left, different slang, different sports priorities. Cricket and Australian rules football dominate conversations the way American football and basketball do in the US. Even the seasons are flipped. Christmas happens in summer, July brings winter. Imagine celebrating the 4th of July equivalent in cold weather. It flips your sense of rhythm. And then there's the road trip factor. In the United States, you can drive through multiple major cities within hours. In Australia, you can drive for hours and see barely another car. The emptiness is part of the identity. It's not crowded. It's not tightly packed. It's wide open. Which leads to a powerful realization. Size isn't just about land area. It's about how that land feels. In America, size feels busy. In Australia, size feels vast. Another rehook hits here. If Australia is so massive, why doesn't it dominate headlines the way other continents do? Geography again. It's far from the power centers of Europe and North America. Time zones separate it from Western media cycles. Its relative isolation makes it quieter globally, even though its landmass is enormous. And that quietness feeds the illusion of smallness. But talk to Americans who actually visit, and the reaction shifts dramatically. They land expecting a compact adventure. They leave realizing they barely scratched the surface. Visiting Sydney, Melbourne, and Brisbane still doesn't equal seeing Australia. There are deserts larger than some countries, national parks that stretch endlessly, coastlines that feel untouched. And then comes the final mental shift. Australia isn't small. It's just alone. It doesn't share borders that visually expand its presence on maps. It doesn't sit next to giant land masses that frame it. It floats in blue. And that blue space tricks the eye into underestimating what sits there. So the next time someone casually calls Australia a small country, pause. Ask them how big is Australia really. Ask them to compare it properly. Ask them to look beyond the distorted classroom map. Because once you see it in true scale, you can't unsee it. Australia is not just a country with beaches and wildlife. It is a continent-sized landmass with deserts, snowfields, rainforests, megacities, and empty highways that stretch into silence. It's a place where one state dwarfs entire American regions, where one flight across the country rivals coast-to-coast travel in the US. And maybe the biggest surprise of all? It was never hiding. It was always there. We just weren't looking at it the right way. So now the question flips back to you. When you picture the world map in your head, does Australia still look small? Or did your perspective just expand? Because sometimes the biggest discoveries aren't about new places. They're about seeing familiar ones clearly for the first time.